everybody, I'm Yara Allen, and I'm from the Forward Together Moral Movement in North Carolina. And I wear many titles: mother, daughter, sister. But the one I love most, also organizer with the North Carolina NAACP, but the one that I'm just so proud of is the fact that I'm a Moral Monday arrestee. So the mugshot is not cute, but I love it. So I have got, when I got here, the feel of North Carolina's Moral Monday was here, and I couldn't wait to get back to my friends and, you know, text them, tweet them, however I could get to them and say, guess what? They are on fire here. And you all, I love the music, I love the spirit and everything, because we know that music is really the personality of a movement. And I like to tell people that when you go into a club, those of us who have visited once or twice, if you go there and there's no music there, what happens? We leave. Music, there's in the African American tradition, it's said that, in the spiritual tradition, it's said that when you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about. I used to hear my grandmother say that when you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about. It confuses the enemy when the music comes. So when we're oppressed and we're facing all of these extreme legislation, when we sing, it confuses them. They don't understand it. They lock us up and we sing. They run us away, we sing. And there's a song that I used to hear my grandmother sing, and she moaned somewhere in between that, and it would sound something like this. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. You know that everything will be all right. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. You know that everything will be all right. March on just a little while longer. March on just a little while longer. March on just a little while longer. I know everything will be all right. I tell you, everything will be all right. Good Lord, everything will be all right.
Ms. Yara Allen, everything will be all right. Let's sing it while you're standing. Come on and fight on just a little while. Oh, fight on. Just a little while. My Lord, just a little while. You know that everything will be all right. You know that everything will be no matter what the governor says, you know that everything will be all right. Forward together. Forward together. Forward together. Amen. Gracious God, we thank you for the privilege to stand. Grant us your strength. Your words, we know that when men or women stand, we stand in our frailty. But it is because you put treasure in earthen vessel that the excellency of the power might be of you and not of us. Let the words of our mouth and meditation of our heart be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and blessed Redeemer. Amen. Amen. It is good to be in Wisconsin. I just left Selma on Sunday with 25,000 people crossing the Edmunds Pettis Bridge. And I am quite familiar with the history in this particular place. Let me first give honor to the pastor of this church, Scott Zorenson, in his absence. Let me thank my president, because when state presidents come to another state, we submit to that authority, if you will. So let me thank our President Wilson, which he stand, and Vice President Harris, who's been such a great driver. Amen. Thank God for them. Our branch presidents. Blame everything I do on Patrick Barrett and Jonathan Rosenblum. I want to get that out of the way. I want to get that out of the way now. Blame everything on them. And I understand as an African-American Ishmael, how'd you say that? Hosanna, first African-American DA right here. Amen. And there's this guy named Carl Gibson who came all the way down to North Carolina and got arrested. Where's Carl? There he is. Is that the right person? Is that the right person? Came down, didn't you come down? That's what I thought. And why don't you give it up for one of the Mahalia Jacksons of our movement, Miss Yara Allen. I bring you greetings on behalf of all of the members of the Forward Together Moral Movement in North Carolina. And tonight I want to talk with you, converse with you, maybe preach some, lecture some, about moral dissent. Yes. Moral dissent, say that. Moral dissent is the pathway, yes, the pathway to higher ground, in our nation. Psalm 94 in the Bible says, who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? Isaiah 10 in the Jewish scriptures says, woe unto those that legislate evil. Woe unto those who pass oppressive decrees that rob the poor of their rights and make women pray and rob the children of their dreams. Isaiah 58 says, and I think it's appropriate in this season of Lent, it raises the question, is this the kind of fast that the Lord requires? No, the kind of fast, the kind of ritual that the Lord requires is that you care for the poor, that you loose the bands of wickedness. And in Hebrew, that literally means that you pay people what they deserve and remove exploitation from the workplace. And then a nation can be called the repairer of the breach. In Ezekiel chapter 1, God asked Ezekiel this question. He gave him a command. He said, stand up, son of man, and speak to the people. They may not listen, but at least they will know there hath been a prophet among them. And then in Ezekiel 37, God asked him, looking out over a vast group of people that had become dejected because of political and economic exploitation, can these bones live? And then in the New Testament, Jesus starts his first sermon, what we call in theology nominal preaching. He starts his first sermon by declaring, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, and recovery of sight to the blind, healing to the brokenhearted, liberty to the captive, and to declare the acceptable year of the Lord. Now I lift these scriptures as moral tenets in our different faith traditions, and I could pull information from the Hindu tradition, or pull from the Muslim tradition, or pull from the Baha'i tradition, because a few weeks ago I was in a room where all faiths came together just before nearly 100,000 people gathered in Raleigh, and we all talked about love and justice, and we saw that in all of our faith, deepest faith traditions, love and justice are at the center of those traditions. We find ourselves united. The psalmist, as you saw it in Psalm 94, actually in that text puts a question on God's lips. And it's a strange question in the text because it suggests that God is experiencing being lost. And what has caused God to feel lost is that he can't find anybody that will stand up against oppression. And God is confused because God says, wait a minute, I know I have some people here that I brought out of oppression. Where are they? And that's why the psalmist says, who will stand up against them? In Luke's text that grows out of the Isaiah text, Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. But the word that Jesus uses, or at least the word that Luke puts on the lips of Jesus, poor, in that scripture is one of three words. It's the word patokos in Greek, which means those who have literally been made poor through the economic systems of exploitation. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to tell the poor that they are not what Cicero described them as, the dregs of the city. To say, as Philip Eastler says, Jesus challenges the 1% arrogance of the ancient Roman Empire that pounded on the 99%. Jesus, in his first sermon, challenges social Darwinism that leaves people hurting and blind through all kinds of political and economic exploitation. And in Jesus' first sermon, he dissents against exploitation and declares to the political and economic powers of his day, even the religionists of his day, that those they dismiss, the poor and the hurting and the sick, those they disdain, those they disregard, are actually at the center of God's attention, and that God is on their side as they fight for liberation. Jim Wallace, one of my mentors, who wrote a book called God Politics, says that he's always taken aback when religionists, particularly those of the so-called religious right, want to lift up a few issues and quote a few scriptures, when in fact there are more than 300 scriptures in the Bible that have to do with the issue of how we treat the poor, how we treat women, how we pay people what they deserve, how we help the sick, and how we care for those on the margins. And in fact, if you were to cut all of the scriptures out of the Bible that deal with those issues, there would be no Bible. Recently, you know, Rush Limbaugh had the unmitigated gall to challenge the Pope. And suggest that the Pope, this new Pope, don't y'all like this new Pope? I do. Yeah. And challenged him because he was suggesting that talking about the poor is some strange form of redistribution of wealth as socialists. And the Pope said, listen, Rush. You're out of your league. What you don't know is that caring for the poor and workers' right is not communism, it's the gospel. Walter Brueggemann, one of the thinkers in the Christian tradition, says the prophetic moral voice is not issue-based. It accomplishes the harder, more necessary work of reframing the big picture of what is at stake so that we can take in the reality of our moment in a new way. Walter Brueggemann goes on to say that the prophetic moral voice doesn't just criticize social and spiritual shortcomings, but also energizes people with a hope that alternatives are possible. What the prophetic moral voice infuses in people the kind of hope that is subversive, the kind of hope that says we no longer have to believe the lies and the myths of domination. We can break free from the domination that we have given our allegiances to. He goes on to say that moral hope is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. It's a subversive kind of hope. It can get you killed. That's why Dr. King was killed for simply saying, I have a dream. He wasn't talking about daydreaming. He wasn't talking about Walt Disney dreaming. He was talking about this hope that inspires people to say that injustice doesn't have the last word. And so Brueggemann goes on to say it is the vocation of a moral voice to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing alternative futures, to believe that something is possible other than simply what is. Dr. William Turner, one of my professors at Duke, wrote an article on black evangelicalism talking about moral movements, and he said, whatever you call your spiritual experience, you know, born again, saved, washed in the blood, felt the Spirit, touched by the universe, whatever your claim of moral or spiritual experience, he says, if it does not end or if it does not bring you to in a space where you have a quarrel with the world and a quarrel with injustice, your claim to spirituality is deeply suspect. Moral dissent. Moral dissent in the faith tradition is God's way of saying there is a better way, there is another way, there is higher ground. But moral dissent is not just religious teaching, it has been in our history. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, one day when he was rescued from being lynched by a pro-slavery mob, and he was incarcerated in Boston, and he wrote on his cell, on October 21st, 1835, William Lloyd Garrison was put in this cell to save him from the violence of a respectable and influential mob. Because he sought to engage in the moral action of destroying the abominable and dangerous position of slavery, and he dared to preach the dangerous doctrine that all men are created equal. Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, protested the war in Mexico. He wrote a book on resistance and civil government. And Thoreau said, when there is an unjust law, like the laws legalizing the institution of slavery, then it is the duty of every man to break that law. A true patriot would not allow injustice to stand. And so the story goes that Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Henry Thoreau in jail, and he said in a scandalizing tone, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" To which Henry Thoreau said, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" And then in one other article, Henry Thoreau said, "The only thing I will apologize for is my good behavior in the face of such evil and injustice." There is a time that we are not supposed to behave. We are supposed to engage in our deepest nonviolent and moral struggle that we can muster. Teddy Roosevelt, 1912, a Republican, described his stance on health care, 1912, described his stance on health care, living wages, and conservation of the environment as moral issues. Dr. King, 50 years ago, in 1963, under heavy criticism, when white clerics wrote him and said, you're going too fast, why are you in Birmingham? He said, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. And he said, the Lord sent prophets to go beyond the boundaries of their hometown, because there is no boundary when it comes to standing up against injustice. Kennedy and Johnson called segregation, Jim Crow, a moral problem. Jonathan? In 1965, Father James Gropey and 3 other Catholic priests from Milwaukee made the trip to Selma by car. That's your history. They came back with a deep commitment to racial justice and nonviolent direct action. While they're in Selma, they live with the local folks at the George Washington Carver Homes, a housing project. They attended meetings in the black church, Brown Chapel AME Church, Zion Church. When they heard that a bunch of SNCC workers in Montgomery had been attacked by club-wielding police officers on horseback, they piled in the car and they drove to Selma from here. And Father Gropey's powerful leadership and grassroots energy, he generated this fusion faith politics, white man, pastoring a predominantly black church. And you remember the history tells us how he became such a prominent leader of civil rights in Wisconsin. He led the Milwaukee open housing movement. And what I love about that story is he did not have one rally. 200 consecutive night marches. 200, that's the history here. And on April 29th, one day before my 3rd birthday, Gropey led a march across the 16th Street Viaduct, a long bridge between the largely African-American North Side and mostly white working-class South Side. 13,000 angry white spectators showed up to jeer, throw rocks, bottles, eggs, urine, firecrackers to chant white power and we want slaves. The NAACP Youth Council's Freedom House was firebombed or tear gas, but he didn't stop. He turned the 16th Street Viaduct into an Edmunds Pettus Bridge in the north. And that is why many people saw Milwaukee as the Selma of the North. But he did that from a deep moral perspective. Interesting, not long ago, last year in June, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg raised moral dissent and constitutional dissent when she wrote about the terrible Voting Rights Act decision by the 5 majority on the Supreme Court. Listen at how she frames her argument. She says hubris is the fit word for today's demolition of the VRA. She said it is like being in the rain and throwing away your umbrella in the rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Then she argued the law, and then she almost became a prophet. She turned and looked at those justices and she said, you may have the victory today, but she reminded them of a higher law. She talked about the campaign from Selma, Alabama. She quoted Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the university is long, but it bends toward justice. In other words, she said, you may have 5 votes now, but there is a higher court, there is a moral court that will judge you in history and will ultimately win. Ultimately win. So, moral dissenters are in good company. I could list many more. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Cesar Chavez. But the reason I raise this about moral dissent and a movement rooted in moral dissent is because in this moment in history, I believe we are being called to answer once again the psalmist's question, who will stand against the workers of injustice? I believe, and we see it in Wisconsin, we see it in North Carolina, that America is in the midst of a 3rd Reconstruction. Listen at me, let me lecture for a moment. The first Reconstruction was primarily in the South, 1868 to say 1898. Blacks, whites, many clergy came together in the South, came together, and they decided, black and white, 146 years ago, that they would come out of the ugly vestiges of slavery by forming fusion coalitions that would push voting rights, educational rights, tax reform, criminal justice, labor rights, and change the nation. And I want you to know that in North Carolina, for instance, it was led by 2 preachers, Samuel Ashley, a Northern Congregational preacher, and J.W. Hood, who was a Methodist, AME Zion Methodist preacher who later became the president of Livingstone College. Listen at how they framed the new Constitution in this deep moral language. This is from 1868. We hold it to be self-evident that all persons are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which these are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor. See, labor without labor rights is slavery.
That's right.
They knew that 146 years ago. And they put it in the Constitution that you must be able to enjoy the fruit of your own labor and then the pursuit of happiness. They went on to say all political power is vested in and derived from the people, and all government of right originates from the people and is founded upon their will only. They made education a constitutional right, Sister Wilson, in 1868. Blacks and whites fusing together in the South. Now, Tim Tyson and I often discuss this period when we review books like the one Professor Steve Kentrovitz wrote, More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic. It's a very important book on black politics. And we look at Reconstruction through the lens of what was happening. Because immediately following a short period of Reconstruction where blacks and whites were coming together looking like this room, immediately there was the immoral acts of deconstruction, led by the radical and racist Dixiecrats who called themselves the Redemption Movement. And their argument was they will redeem America from the power of black and white people working together to establish a more perfect union. That's exactly what their language was. They said they were raised up in history to take back America. Where have I heard that before? And by 1872, they had formed a Klan to primarily attack white people and push white people away from Fusion Coalition. Then they attacked voting rights, 1872. They wrote new voting laws in state legislatures. Where have I heard that before? They came up with literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clause. And then they worked to stack the Supreme Court with extremist judges who believed in white supremacy. And then those judges used their power on the Supreme Court to roll back all of the progressive laws that had been passed in the Reconstruction period. And so we learned from the first Reconstruction that the strategy to stop any effort at moral reconstruction and fusion politics has always consisted of 5 attacks. They attacked voting rights, they attacked educational opportunity, they attacked labor rights, they attacked fair tax revenue that allows the government to have the money it needs to uplift all of us, and they attack or they assassinate white and black progressive leaders. Wherever there is a moral reconstruction, there will be immoral deconstruction. Then with the second Reconstruction is 1954, 1968. Starts with Brown versus Board of Education. That's a rough way of delineating the time. And that ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, led by blacks and whites. Thurgood Marshall had a core of lawyers, black, white, and Jewish. They'd been working for 50 years after Charles Hamilton Houston had used the dissent of one Supreme Court justice out of Kentucky to build a legal case against Plessy versus Ferguson. They won. It spurred a movement, fueled a movement. The death of Emmett Till on August 28th fueled a movement. Rosa Parks said when his mother wouldn't allow his face to be covered in that coffin, it did something to her. She said, we gotta stand up and we gotta fight. And so between 1954 and 1968, with blacks and whites and Latinos and labor and civil rights and coming together, we saw tremendous change, a second Reconstruction, affirmative action, Committee on Equal Employment Opportunities, Social Security amendments of 1965, 1954, and then the amendments of 65 that created Medicare and Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, and listen at what Johnson said on August 6, 1965, referring to the Voting Rights Act. He said it was a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on the battlefield. But he also went on to say, I fear that we have given away the South for the next 40 years. Because he understood that wherever there is reconstruction, moral reconstruction, there will be a reaction of immoral deconstruction. Fusion politics, moral politics, change the context of the, notice, moral politics and fusion politics didn't always change who was elected. It changed the context in which they had to operate.
That's right.
That's a different role. See, sometimes we get caught up just in electoral politics and we get suckered into measuring our success just by election. But when you talk about moral and fusion politics, if it's right, if it's consistent, if it's strong enough, like it did in the 60s, you can change the context in which elected officials operate in, and then they have to do what they didn't expect to do. So you get Johnson, a former segregationist, signing off on the Voting Rights Act. You see what I'm saying? When the context is changed, you get Republicans and Democrats joining together to sponsor the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the voting rights. You remember when Johnson told Dr. King, we can't do this now. We got Vietnam, I've got this war on poverty, I have all these attacks, and the story goes that Dr. King picked up his hat and John said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to Selma to create the context so you can do what you need to do. But remember, as it is with social physics, the transformative power of moral-based fusion politics always comes under attack. And the attack, the second Reconstruction, was defined and developed by Kevin Phillips, a Nixon Republican strategy. He came up with this thing called the white Southern strategy. Now, it wouldn't just be used in the South, but it would blatantly be used in the South. It was a strategy designed to deliberately play the race card in a way to drive Southern whites and working class whites to vote for ultra-conservative white politicians by fueling the lie that somehow social programs were benefiting undeserving minorities. Where have I heard that before? Recently. Huh? And it was designed to cause African American whites, but working class whites, to vote against their own self-interest. Now, we didn't know all of this until GOP strategist Lee Atwater did a little tape that's now out on Google, and he actually said this. Now, this is pretty harsh language. He said, you start out in 1954 by saying N to get elected. But by 68, you can't use the N word. It'll hurt you, it'll backfire you. So you start using code words to racialize politics and to scare people, like forced busing, like states' rights, like cutting taxes. And then he says, this is his words, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic, but the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and that it scares working class whites to vote against their own future. And they used that. The target of the Southern strategy was all of the old Confederacy with the goal of developing the solid South. And it worked. It solidified the South, and then it migrated even in the North. And by 1980, when Ronald Reagan ran for president, this code word, new racialized, immoral politics was so embedded in the body politics that Ronald Reagan goes to Neshoba County in Mississippi, where Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed, and there he delivers a speech announcing his campaign for presidency. And he uses all the code words. He calls the Civil Rights Act bad legislation that infringed upon individual rights. Have you heard that before? He said the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was a violation of states' rights. He championed anti-labor rights and positions and lumped all of them in, voting rights, labor rights, educational opportunity, as detriments to America. His stump speech featured criminals who drove fleets of Cadillacs that they had bought with food stamps. And he did it unashamedly, unabashedly. And he won a landslide using this new strategy. The South went ultra-conservative in percentages so high that it became clear that the Southern strategy had worked, and the second Reconstruction was basically over. Then you have something strange to happen. You have a guy named Barack Obama run for president in 2008, right in the middle of an economic crisis that has forced us to see a little clearer our inescapable mutuality. Now, I don't want to talk about the president. I'm not here to talk partisan. I'm talking about the electorate. See, it's not just the president. The electorate that elected him came about when we were in pain as a nation. That's right. And the economic pain forced us to see our inescapable mutuality. We could see as a nation for just a moment the damage of policies that cut voting rights, cut labor rights, cut taxes for the wealthy, and treats people like things and corporations like people. That's right. And in the midst of that context, he runs a campaign rooted in the idea of fusion politics, like the 1800s, like the 1960s. He wins in places like North Carolina, in the South, in Virginia. But it's not just him. Look at the electorate. The electorate was broad, it was deep, it was young, it was old, it was labor, it was faith, it was Democrat, it was Republican, it was independent, it was LGBT, it was black, it was Hispanic, it was Asian. It was people who wanted to push America beyond the vestiges of racism and to a more just place. And it might just work this time. It might just work. The demographics are changing. More black and brown people, younger folk are not as bound as they once were. Latinos are here. People are coming together, gay and straight. But that new electorate scares the daylights out of those who have a homogeneous view of our political system. That's right. It does not fit their worldview. So what did you see? What did we see almost immediately? An all-out assault again on this process that was reconstructing America. This attack on voting rights starts immediately after the election and is followed with an avalanche and a ferocity funded by wealthy extremists like the Koch brothers, whose philosophy traces all the way back to their daddy, Freddie Koch, who founded the John Birch Society that attacked labor rights and civil rights and progressive Republicans in the 1950s. Those who believe in a more narrow-minded America saw this electorate that produced the first African-American president as a danger to the worldview. So they attacked the only coalitions that can keep that worldview going: labor, immigrants, those who believe in fair tax policy, educational advocates, health advocates, and civil rights advocates. The point I'm trying to make is that every time this nation has stepped forward toward moral reconstruction, we see patterns of immoral deconstruction. We saw it in the 1800s, we saw it in the 1900s, and we're seeing it again. And if we understand where we are in history, then we'll understand how we have to fight in this moment. That's what I'm saying. Turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, we who believe in freedom and fairness and justice are not being fought because of our weakness. They are afraid of our strength. And if we all get together, what a day, what a day, what a day of change in America. You see, I come from a faith tradition that understands when people put you on a cross, it's not because you're weak. Huh? And so I'm calling on my brothers and sisters who believe in progress, come up out of that depression and understand you're being attacked because we're about to change the world, not because we're weak. There's an army rising that's going to break every chain of injustice, every chain of denial, every chain of economic exploitation. And You've got to believe. You know, there was a saying that 12 spies went into the promised land and they saw some giants. 10 of them came back and said, we are like grasshoppers. See, the first thing that's got to happen in the progressive movement, you have got to stop seeing yourself through the eyes of your adversary. And because we understand this, in North Carolina, we came together not last year, but 7 years ago. I want you to understand, this movement that you see on TV didn't start last year. 7 years ago when CNN and all the people weren't there. 7 years ago when Democrats were in office. We challenged them. Because a moral movement doesn't just challenge one party. Now certainly, and we had significant victories. And we were expecting a backlash, because anytime a progressive movement, a moral movement has victories, there will be backlash. And this year we're together though because of the great deal of extremism. But let me tell you what we believe is the model for those of us who still believe in justice and freedom. We believe if we're going to change America, you have to think states. It's not about having some national person come in, helicopter in your state, take a picture, lead a march, and leave. Movements start from Selma up, from Milwaukee up. They don't start from Washington, D.C. down. Movements start from Madison up, or Madison over, and Greensboro up, not from D.C. and New York down. So what we believe is that in this moment of history, if we're in the middle of a third Reconstruction, this is what we need. We need indigenously led, state-based, focused on state government, not focused straight on the legislature and the government, yes. Deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racism, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movements in every state. Now, our relationship with our coalition partners, we have learned, must be transformative, not transactional. In other words, you can't have people in the coalition who are just there until they win. We need people who understand the intersectionality and the connectivity between the issues that each partner focuses on. And so if you believe in environmental rights, you also have to believe in labor rights. If you believe in labor rights, you've got to believe in voting rights. You believe in voting rights, you've got to believe in educational rights. You believe in educational rights, you've got to believe in health care. They all go together. You see, the greatest myth of our times is that extreme politics only hurts a small subset of people. And what the extremists do, notice I didn't say Democrat or Republican, I said extremists. What the extremists do is they try to make us fight separately. They attack us separately and make us fight separately. But we must understand that extremist policies hurt us all. I never will forget when we got in the middle of the LGBT fight in North Carolina. Some friends asked me, well, why are you involved as a black preacher? Why are you involved in the LGBT? I said, first of all, this isn't a war between the black church and the LGBT. That's a false notion. That's a notion that a religious right tried to understand. If anybody has understood grace in America, it's the black church. Huh? Okay. So first of all. Second of all, I said to them, because the 14th Amendment was passed to provide equal protection under the law for every citizen because of what had been done to black people. And because black people know the original sin of America, which is racism. And because black people know that once that sin was committed, it took 250 years of chattel slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, martyrs and people being killed, and we still haven't gotten over it. We ought to be the last ones that want to see anybody codify hate into our Constitution. It's simple. And using, and they said, but it's not the same thing as racial discrimination. I said, I know that, but it's discrimination. And because I've been touched by America's original sin of racial discrimination, then I have to stand opposed to all of the foreign friends. And using that argument, we were able to get allies who were theologically and in their own churches, based on the First Amendment, the right from and for of religion, they were not totally for same-sex marriage, but they stood with us against Amendment 1 on the moral and constitutional principle that even if I've not come to that point inside my church sanctuary, I have to be against anything that codifies hate and discrimination within the laws of this land. The laws of this land. And so, in North Carolina, we've come together, black, white, Latino, Native American. We are Democrat and Republican and independent. We are people of all faiths and not of faith, but who believe in a moral universe. We are natives and immigrants. We are business leaders and workers and unemployed. We are doctors and uninsured. We are gay and straight students and parents. We are the NAACP, labor, educational advocates, veterans, peace advocates. We all stand together to lift up and defend the most sacred moral principles of our faith and our constitutional values. And those are, I am my brother's keeper. Those are what matters in life is how do we treat the least of these. Those are establishing justice for all people. And we found commonality in that.
That's right.
And then we look at things through a constitutional and moral lens. The movement in North Carolina is about the moral fabric. Say moral fabric of our society. And we believe we are called to a deeply moral and constitutional vision of what is possible. We look at public policy through the moral lens of justice for all and through the constitutional principle of governing for the good of the whole. And then we point out how extremist policy is morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, and economically insane. That's the critique. And we need movements in every state that are focused on the state legislatures and the governor that examines policies based on this. Is it morally defensible? Is it constitutionally consistent? And is it economically sane? And if it's not, regardless of party, we call it out. We also in our movement address directly the fallacies of the so-called religious right that seeks to limit the moral debate to abortion, homosexuality, and prayer in the school. First problem with that, there are no scriptures in the Bible about prayer in the school. Not about prayer in the house. And the other issues that they raise, there may be one or two scriptures they misinterpret, most of them, and none of the scriptures in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, speak to the issue of allowing you to hate somebody. In fact, even in the Old Testament, the demand of the Torah was that you treated the stranger the same way you treat your brother. And so we must challenge the religious right. And to my progressive friends, you can't throw out religion just because people have messed it up. And when you want to debate somebody on the religious right, the best debate is not necessarily having somebody who's an atheist. I'm not against that. That's your position. But what you need is an evangelical like me challenging the so-called heresy of the religious right evangelicalism. And say brother to brother, sister to sister. I don't see how you're ignoring. The fact of the matter is you need somebody like me or some other preacher that can say to the so-called conservative religious right, I don't even think you're conservative. Because I'm a true conservative. Amen. See, conservative means to hold on to the essence of. So if the essence of faith is love and justice and mercy and treating people right and helping the least of these, then how do you say you're a conservative if all you're concerned about is who you can hurt, who you can put out, and who you can divide? So you got to take the language back. So I often say to my religious right brothers and sisters, you all are quite liberal. Because you liberally leave out the essence of what faith is all about. And so I tell them, if you want to have a debate about morality with a real conservative, bring it on, baby. Bring it on, baby. Bring it on. Now, the next thing about this coalition, I'm almost through, is that it must take the issue of race seriously.
That's right.
And race cannot just be where the NAACP talks about race. First of all, the NAACP is not a black organization. It's a justice organization. And the early leadership was white. So I'm hoping as we're building these branches, there's a lot of diversity in them. Okay? But the coalition, a Fusion Moral Coalition, must take race seriously. Our movement was born in the South because we can't afford to be ahistorical. Anti-racism and poverty must be at the heart of our struggle. Somebody asked, and one of our leaders, Al McShirley, which issue is most important, racism or poverty? He said yes. And we're both of them. You can't separate them. Huh? Why are you passing a voter ID that 67% of women don't have? You see, that's coalition, when we care about both each other's issues. And I don't win until you win. And so we believe there are 5 areas we ought to be able to agree on. In NAACP, we call them game changers. We shouldn't have to have 5 more meetings deciding what our issues are. We ought to know by now. And here are the 5 we suggest. Secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for employment, living wages, labor rights, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy. Affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, and strong safety nets for the poor, and fair policies for immigrants, and infrastructure development and fair tax reform. Number 2, educational equality by ensuring every child receives a high quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education. Number 3, health care for all by ensuring access to the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and providing environmental protection. Number 4, fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities and providing equal protection under the law for black, brown, and poor white people. And number 5, protect and expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrants' rights, and the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law for everybody. We believe that those 5 issues go together like the fingers on a hand. And when we fold our hand together, we have a mighty fist of solidarity that can pull people together. And so, extremism came in our state because it was the natural reaction to success. And yes, 2013 has been hard. They cut, in the first 50 days, they cut Medicaid for 500,000 people. 2,800 people died. They raised taxes on 900,000 people by ending earned income tax credit so they could give a tax break to 23 of the richest families. They cut unemployment benefits for 165,000 people. They passed policies that would resegregate our schools. They passed a policy to take our public tax money and give it to private schools. They eliminated preschool for more than 30,000 poor children. And they passed the worst voter suppression bill after Sheldon. An avalanche of extremist policy. Right. And for a moment, people were depressed. And then we reached down and we said, maybe that's why we've been building this coalition for 7 years. Somebody said maybe we were born for such a time as this. And then we decided that extreme public policy that crucifies the sick, crucifies children, and crucifies education, and crucifies labor rights, crucifies fair tax policies, and crucifies voting rights. Every crucifixion must have a witness. And so we came together even deeper, shoulder to shoulder. We met with the governor. He wouldn't listen to us. We tried to meet with the legislature. He wouldn't listen to us. We brought 20,000 people to the General Assembly, 1,000 grassroots activists. But what we were doing was meeting every step of civil disobedience. See, there's steps to it. And once we'd met all the tenets, after they passed on April the 4th, the worst voter suppression bill, the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, they decided to assassinate voting rights. On April 29th, in the middle of Pentecost, we decided that now was the time to go to civil disobedience. And we went to civil disobedience, 17 of us. 17 of us went in, but the reason it had impact is because we'd had all this relationship for 7 years. 17 of us said it was time to say to that army that's out there, somebody has to stand no matter what party is in power. Somebody has to refuse to believe that just because folk have a political supermajority, it gives them the authority to run roughshod over the Constitution. Somebody has to say there are some things that transcend political majorities and mere politics and the narrow categories of liberal versus conservative and Democrat versus Republican. Somebody has to challenge things because they're low down and wrong and extreme and immoral. Somebody has to take the stance that God asked Ezekiel to take. He said, stand up. They may not listen to you at first, but at least they will know there has been a prophet among them. And so we took our stance, singing and praying in the legislature, 17 of us, declaring it's extreme and mighty low to make it harder for people to vote. It's extreme and mighty low to be a government official and you get health care because you're elected and didn't want to allow the people that elected you to have the same health care. It's extreme to kick people when they're down and deny them earning income tax credit and unemployment when they have lost their jobs of no fault of their own. It's extreme to undermine people's labor rights. It's extreme to dismantle our public schools in order to hand them over to private companies. It's extreme. It's low down. It's wrong. And there is a necessity for the destiny of our democracy that we push and realize that we must look at policy through the moral lens of justice for all. We have to raise our moral dissent, knowing that whether it's heard now or it's heard later, it will be heard. And history has shown us that moral dissent sows the seed of change and justice that eventually blossoms on the landscape of democracy. You have to sow it. And so we must raise our moral dissent because it's our calling to do so. I can't promise you that if you do it in Wisconsin, everything's going to happen overnight. But I can promise you that faith without works is dead, but faith with works can set a stage for things to change. And so I'm glad today to be a part of a generation of moral dissenters. I'm glad today to be among those who give voice and spirit and bodies to the cause of justice. I'm glad today because it's our turn now. I stopped by here to tell you, Martin King is not going to get up and come back. Ella Baker's not coming back. Father Gropey is not coming back. Susan B. Anthony is not coming back. Cesar Chavez is not coming back. But guess what? Their children are here. We are the ones that we have been looking for. Others have come before us. And I know as I conclude that we see some mighty low-down things happening now. We see some extreme public policy happening now. They're operating out of fear. They want to take us backwards. They want to overturn all of the success of the past. They want us, Sister Wilson, to take us down the low road to destruction. But I stopped by to say tonight that we must be the ones who demand higher ground. We have to say to this nation, we refuse to accept the low ground of extremism and the road to destruction. We believe in higher ground where every child is educated, higher ground where labor rights are protected, higher ground where we give folk living wages, higher ground where the sick have health care, higher ground where the environment is protected, higher ground where everybody's vote is protected and is unabridged and unfettered, higher ground where we tackle the problem of poverty, higher ground where we care more about people than we do about the profits of corporations, higher ground where we see all people, regardless of their color, regardless of their sexuality, regardless of their income, as God's special creation. Higher ground where we as a nation don't just sing America, America, God shed his grace on thee, but where we show grace to immigrants, where we show grace to the least of these, where we show grace to the workers. And so let us declare in this moment that if we take this nation to the moral academy, if we take this nation to school, if we stand up in this moment, there will be a day when our children's children will honor our memory because we did not give up on higher ground. Higher ground. And I'm telling you, I'm almost through, Jonathan. I'm tired. I've been so long. But I'm telling you what's wrong with me. When I got off the plane and I got here, I felt a spirit here. I felt a revival in Wisconsin. And I'm sorry, but I'm just a country preacher. And whenever the Spirit says preach, I preach. Whenever the Spirit says march, I march. Whenever the Spirit says stand, I stand. And I feel something in Wisconsin. They might have beat you down on the uprising, but there's another rising coming. We can't turn back now. It was too hard to get the rights we've won. Too many people have died. Too many people have sacrificed. Too much blood has been shed. Turn to your neighbor and say, we can't turn back now. All over this nation, tell them, we can't turn back now. Let me be a country preacher for 5 minutes and close with God's question to Ezekiel. Can these bones live? Can there be a revival in Wisconsin despite what the governor is doing or the legislature is doing? Can there be a revival in North Carolina despite what the extremists can do? Well, I want to testify tonight. And I want to tell you what I've seen, not just what I've heard. At the beginning of 2013 in North Carolina, people were depressed. A group of extremists came into office. They began the politics of attack. On April 29th, 17 of us that have been organizing for years decided to take a moral stance. We did. The next week, we didn't call anybody, but 34 more people came and did the same thing. The next week, 68. And after 13 weeks, 945 people were arrested for civil disobedience. More than any time in the history of America at a state capitol. We went in because God said we went in, said to go in. We were hoping that we could speak to their conscience. But instead of listening, they laughed at us. They called us outsiders and morons, and they arrested us, and our arrest sheet says arrested for praying, singing, and talking loud. In other words, we got arrested for preaching. But I'll stop by to tell you we couldn't stop all of that legislation. But now, after almost a year, we've had 76 Moral Monday efforts. Now, though they dismissed us, the movement in North Carolina is an inspiration all around the country. Now, though they said it wouldn't make a difference, they said it was a waste of time, They said the legislators wouldn't listen, and they were right partially. But since April 29th, daring to speak truth and love and a moral vision of community, the dry bones have come together. From 17 on April 29th to over 100,000 4 weeks ago on February the 8th, the dry bones are coming together. We started out with a few thousand hits on social media. Now we have over 1 million. The dry bones are coming together. The Forward Together Moral Monday movement is now listed as one of the top 40 movements in the world. The dry bones are coming together. When we started, the governor was at 50%. When I left, he was under 30% in the poll. The dry bones are coming together. When we started, the legislature was at 40%. Now they're under 19%. The dry bones are coming together. When we started, they said we were just adjunct Democrats. But now 16% of our movement are Republicans and independents. The dry bones are coming together. When we started, they said it wouldn't matter. But now in Mitchell County, which is 89% Republican, the Republican chair has renounced the party of extremism and joined the movement toward higher ground. Oh, I'm here to tell you, higher ground is possible. I don't know when we will see final political victory, but that's not what matters. What matters first is that you change the heart and the consciousness of the people, and you make a decision with the time and the life that you have that you're not going to participate in other folks' oppression. And what I mean by that, if somebody puts their foot on your neck and you don't tell them to get it off, then you become a participant in their oppression. But if you tell them to get it off, then there's possibility for change to come. And so finally, moral dissent is the only way to save this nation. Moral dissent, fusion politics is the higher ground that we must move to. My son is an environmental physics major. And he tells me some things about the environment and nature. He told me last year, Daddy, if you ever get lost in the mountain territory, don't hike out through the valley. I said, why, son? He said, because snakes live in the valley. He said, if you check with anybody who's ever been a survivalist or a biologist, they'll tell you, if you're going to hike your way out of mountainous territory, it might be tough, but first climb up the mountain. I said, well, why would you climb the mountain? It's easier to go through the valley. He said, yeah, but the snakes are in the valley. He said, but if you go up the mountain a little ways to higher ground, there's a line called the snake line. I said, what's the snake line? He said, snakes can't live at high altitude because snakes are cold-blooded animals. So if you can get above the snake line, the snake can't come down, because when a snake gets too high, they die from asphyxiation. I stopped by to tell you it's time to take this debate above the snake line. It's time to make our way to higher ground. Love is above the snake line. Caring for the least of these is above the snake line. Fighting for labor rights is above the snake line. Treating everybody right is above the snake line. Down in the South, we sing a song, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day. Still praying as I'm freedom bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift us up and let us stand by faith on Canaan's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant America on higher ground. Plant Wisconsin on higher ground. Plant North Carolina on higher ground. Is this time to go above the snake line? Turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, let's build a movement. Tell your neighbor, look at him and say, neighbor, let's build a movement and take this debate above the snake line to higher ground, 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 higher ground. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground.